unraveling the cosmic dance of insider-outsider that empowers poetic creation. When my first book of poems, The Sunset Sonata, got published by Sahitya Academy, I was elated. But apart from that, I experienced yet another sensation quite frequently. I felt hopelessly attached to my poems. The sensation was so strong that if I had written something once, I couldn't bear the thought of even moving one word from here to there. The act of poetic creation in its moment of spontaneous glory was sacrosanct for me. The poems of my first collection were published as it is, without any editing. I couldn't be more pleased regarding that. As I moved to my second poetry collection a couple of years later, I was still vain about my poetry and felt terribly attached to what I wrote. But I somehow started opening up to the idea of looking at my own poems from a detached perspective. The poems I submitted for my second collection were heavily edited, albeit by myself. My publisher, a poet himself, spent a lot of time explaining to me the importance of preserving some semblance of meaning in a poem. This verdict came across as a shock to me because I was cozily basking in the smug glory of the idea of poetry being an act of spontaneous outburst, something like divine writing on the walls that cannot be and should not be changed. But going by my publisher's feedback, I grudgingly started editing my poems. It was a humbling exercise for my poetic self, as I realized that many of my poems were mere verbal acrobatics and glorious exercises in imagination, but they didn't make any sense to the reader. At that moment, I realized that you could talk all about stream of consciousness writing, poetry being a subjective medium and all that, but even within that subjective and symbolic artifice, your poem has to convey a fragment of meaning to somebody somewhere. As I trimmed down my poems, the self-imposed verbosity of my poetic self also shrank. Many poems made their way to the bin. Every poem being included had to be probed and re-inspected from the point of view of making sense to the reader. It was a complicated exercise that perhaps taught me even more about the importance of letting go of vanity as a poet than it taught me about the art and science of editing. It's been about 4 years since my second book was published. I'm now contemplating a third book. With time, I'm experiencing a feeling of peculiar detachment from my poems. I don't know what to call the phenomenon, but I would like to believe it's an act of poetic maturity, or rather my coming of age as a poet. I increasingly tend to look at my poetry as creative products rather than passionate murmurings of the soul. This paradigm shift has both its pros and cons. I no longer feel myself that capable of writing something decisively and spontaneously that seals the deal, not so frequently at least. But at the same time, I feel confident of turning my poems into creative artifacts by revisiting the old ones and planning the new ones a bit consciously. I've reached that phase in my poetic journey where I can discipline myself to write a theme-based poetry collection. In other words, I can now work on my poems a bit like I would work on other non-poetic writing assignments. Does this mean the sublime quality associated with writing poetry is gone? As far as my journey is concerned, not really. I think it simply means I'm no longer vain about my poems and can concentrate better on the craft of writing poems. I can critically introspect my poetry as an art form rather than feeling continuously attached to it. I believe feeling attached to your poetry is very important when you're at the beginning of a poetic journey. Your mind is impressionable and vulnerable, and your poetic ego fragile. At that point, the almost bodily passion you share for your poetry acts as a shield against unwanted toxic criticism. Constructive criticism is different. But when you're in the infant phase of your poetic journey, there's a thin line between constructive criticism and toxic criticism. Therefore, your overconfidence in your verse keeps you safe from the unwanted impact of all trolls. It ensures that you keep writing and move ahead in your poetic journey. But like with every journey, it's important that you become a mature traveler and learn to let go of past illusions with time. That way, the act of writing poetry symbolically mirrors life itself. You gradually let go of preconceived and exaggerated notions of your own poetic grandeur and learn to take your own creations with a pinch of salt. You learn to draw boundaries between your poetic self and the rest of you. You reach a sobering point where you realize that your poetic self is just a part of your identity. It doesn't define you as a whole. When you learn to distance yourself from that poetic self, it's the beginning of a glorious innings of self-reflexivity wherein you develop the critical perspective to evaluate your own creative output like an outsider and make constant improvements. You're in the boundaries of creative practice, acting simultaneously like an insider and outsider, juggling these twin roles with the precision of an acrobat. It again mirrors the process of life itself. You're constantly living inside and outside the confines of your egoistic self. For as long as we're alive, the ego helps us feel, compete, and make efforts for our material and spiritual betterment. Thus, it cannot be abandoned. But at the same time, if you let this ego get the better of you, you're doomed to a life of perpetual misery and unhappiness. That's why it's important every once in a while to step out of the circle of ego and dispassionately evaluate your life like an outsider. It's the same cosmic dancer of insider-outsider that empowers and sustains all artistic creation.